Welcome to Behind the Line, where we pull back the curtain on the challenges facing first responders and frontline workers. The work you do is unique, and so are the stresses that go with it. Join me as we tackle key issues to reduce risks for burnout, and as we work to support you in doing the job you love without sacrificing being the kind of person you want to be. Hey there, and welcome back to Behind the Line. I'm your host, Lindsay Foss. If you're new to Behind the Line, what you should know about me is that I'm a clinical counselor specializing in trauma therapy. And after over a decade working with first responders and frontline workers around issues like burnout, compassion fatigue, PTSD, and related OSIs, I've become a passionate wellness advocate and educator for those who sacrifice so much for our communities out on the front lines. Behind the Line is a place for us to talk about the real life behind the scenes challenges facing you on the front lines. I created this podcast with the hope of bringing easy access to skills for wellness, allowing you to find greater sustainability both on the job and off. Welcome back, everyone. We are in our summer series where we're just hearing stories from various amazing first responders and frontline workers. I'm so grateful to join you again with an amazing guest, and I can hardly wait for you guys to hear it. Let's dive in. Welcome, Stephen. I'm so excited to have you on this show. I've been really looking forward to this conversation for a while. I feel like I had to hunt you down to be able to get this time, but I'm really excited that we were able to make it work. To get us started, I guess what I was hoping to start out with is just a bit of getting your story. So the work that you do, how you got into it, what appealed to you about going into fire service.
Yeah, me entering the fire service was kind of a childhood dream. I was a young kid, kind of a lost little kid at 12 and 13 years of age, and I happened to be sitting on a bus stop and a fire truck went by, and the gentleman on the back smiled and waved at me, and I remember that vision staying in my head, and I thought of that firefighter as a superhero, and I thought I really want to be that one day. And I speak in a lot of schools, and I tell kids, you want to be a nurse, you want to be a doctor, you want to be something, you put that vision in your head and don't let anybody take it away, and you'll become that. And I really believe that in all my heart, because that's exactly what happened to me. So Totally. It took me 7 years and 13 departments to apply to, and finally get accepted by the Surrey Fire Department in 1990. And yeah, it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Very cool. So we were just chatting before I hit record about kind of your journey since then, that you started out in Surrey and have kind of bounced back and forth between there and Esquimalt. So what have you noticed in terms of that kind of career path for you?
Well, I never aspired to be a fire chief in any way, shape, or form, which is funny. If you stay long enough, you will end up either being probably in the executive on the union side, or you'll be in management. And I ended up becoming a chief. And I think one of the things that I noticed right away is that you're very hypervigilant as a firefighter or a captain, but when you become a chief, you're very hypervigilant a completely different way. You're now becoming an expert on reading people's body language. You're an expert on managing your own emotions when you get angry about dealing with people. There's a lot of growth. Well, there's been a lot of growth in becoming a chief for me personally. I think I've had to work very hard at my listening skills. My journey to get here was pretty bumpy, but a pretty straight line. But I had my own mental health challenges about 10 years into my career, and I'm very sensitive and I'd say empathetic to people that are really struggling, and they're, if I can help them, and recognizing that as a manager is something I think you have to learn and be taught. And once you learn it, you can grow. And I've worked with people who are negotiators, and I've managed suicide scenes, and I've been involved in, very, very stressful crisis situations that have failed. So when you go through a failure, say like a jumper that you've been talking with for almost 4 hours, and then that person decides to jump, it doesn't feel good, and so how can you be better? Like, I'm not a crisis negotiator, but I managed some scenes, and so your whole kind of perspective on arriving in a fire truck and helping someone on their worst day, to managing and trying to get a better outcome is very different. The feelings are very different than when I was a firefighter. I could go home in Canada, it's 4 days off. I could
Yeah.
go home on my 4 days off and pretty much shut the job off. There's no shutting the job off when you're a chief. Never.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you had no expectation of ever being chief. I find that fascinating. And I find it fascinating in terms of the next question I have for you, which is when you entered or imagined entering the work, when you had that imagining of like, they're a hero and going into it, what were your expectations? Like, what did you think it was going to be like? And I almost want to ask the same question about almost like that second level of your career in terms of not just how did you imagine it was going to be entering the work, but how did you imagine it was going to be chief that made you not really want to do it until you were in it?
Yeah, you know what? I would say for the first year of getting hired in Surrey, big department, real calls, everything from shootings to fires to overdoses to gang violence. Like you're a real first responder in a way that you see everything and you go to sometimes over 200 calls in a day, that department.
Yeah.
So you're busy. You're very, very focused. But I did find it quite easy to shut off until I had my own, um, I'd call it mental health crisis. I really didn't feel like I was affected by anything. And it kind of blindsided me, to be honest, because I was one of those firefighters that loved coming to work. My wife would say, he's got two families. He's got
Mm-hmm.
us, and then he's got his crew at the fire hall. And
Yeah.
she would always bug me which one I liked the best. And I said, I like them both. It's like,
They got different pros and cons.
yeah, I loved my job. I only had one really, really tough year.
Mm.
And aside from that tough year, I mean, I just smile thinking about my career. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like then it really surprised you when things took a bit of a turn. So tell me a little bit about that. Like where did it feel like the expectations then didn't continue to live up to what I love my job piece where things
yeah,
got harder?
I still love my job, even going through that part. But I had rules in my head that first responders, I work, me and some other firefighters, we instruct behavioral health. It's basically
Mm.
it's mental health first aid, but it has a different spin on it for first responders. And we talk to first responders about rules in your head. And I tell this story. I had rules
Mm.
in my head that kids shouldn't die. So when I
Mm.
would see
Yeah.
a dead child, it affected me.
Yeah.
And in the case where I struggled was um, my daughter had RSV and ended up in Children's Hospital. And they said she was 4 weeks of age that she might pass away. She might not survive this.
Mm.
The swelling in her trach was very,
Yeah.
very bad. And, she was in trouble. So
Mm.
after about a week of being in isolation, I played hockey and lacrosse, and I was very, very active. Being in isolation for a week was hard, but my daughter
Mhm.
was sick. But after about a week, we were expected to be there for weeks. So my wife said, "Why don't you go home, go to work, so you can, just get a
Mhm.
bit of a break and come in between your shifts?" And our son was staying with her neighbors, so I liked that idea. And, we were just sitting in a room with our daughter, a little
Yeah.
baby with tons of electrodes. It was very depressing, very hard. And so I thought that was a good plan. So I went to work, and, within a few minutes of being on shift on my first shift, we had a full rest for a 3 month old, which, working on that kid,
Mhm.
I can see it as I'm telling you the story now that, my daughter's face was flashing in and out when I was working on that little
Yeah.
boy. And, I had another call on the night shift, 11-year-old girl, not wearing a seatbelt, ejected from a vehicle, did CPR on her all the way to Royal Columbian Hospital from Surrey.
Mm.
She passed away. And then we finished that week off with mom in a very low income area, did too much crack. Baby was on her lap and rolled off and suffocated in the couch. And so, you
Mm.
know, 3 CPRs in 1 week. I developed something, I'd call it the flu. I developed not being able to function. I mean, I couldn't think clearly, anxiety, certainly depression. And then I just tried to plow through it. And I was an avid drinker, and drinking was kind of my go to thing. I didn't use any other drugs, but I just really, really tried to make those feelings go away, but I couldn't with alcohol. So
Yeah.
for me personally, I started to, I call it go into a tailspin, and I definitely did. And then my daughter came home and started to recover over the next several months. But my wife knew she had an issue with me and she didn't know what it was. And I was
Mm.
trying to protect my relationship with my wife and my relationship with alcohol. And, I got in a bad way. And, some firefighters came to my house and my wife reached out and said, I'm worried about him. And so they came in and I spent over a year in clinical counseling,
Mhm.
changing the rules in my head. And the rules that I changed were, the rules were, kids shouldn't die, and I changed those rules to kids will die because that's the profession I'm in, and I
Yeah.
will see it. I don't like it, but I can get through it. And changing little rules like that are very important for first responders. And same when I'll give you an example. I managed a jumper call, and he decided he was going to jump, and he jumped. My rules in my head now are, um, I, that was not a good outcome, but it is what we do. And that person, for some reason, needed to end that pain, and he is no
Mhm.
longer in pain anymore. And
Yeah.
so those rules in my head are my survival skills.
Yeah.
I have lots of history with suicide. My own brother took his life and phoned me the
Mhm.
the day he took his
Yeah.
life and told me basically, I'm going to take my life. And I just said, I can't do this anymore because he had told that to me dozens of times.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
pretty much hung the phone up on him, only for him to take his
Mhm.
life.
Yeah.
So you wear that. And when
Yeah.
it's your family or friends, I've had friends take their lives, very hard to change those rules. So I
Totally.
accept that, right? So I accept my factory settings. I accept that I'm a human being. I accept that I'm emotional. And, it took a lot of work to get to a place where I could actually do self positive talk and tell myself
Yeah.
it's okay to cry on your way home from work. It's
Mhm.
okay to get emotional. Those things are okay. And yeah, I really, in the last, decade, I've really got to know myself. And I think that's what first responders don't necessarily do. Like I had a bumpy childhood and, there's things I didn't deal with. And if you're going to come into a profession like policing, paramedicine, or firefighting, and you've got a lot of things from the past that you haven't dealt with, I mean, Gabor Maté speaks to it very well, is that it
Mm.
will stir things up. You will probably go to a traumatic call and you will be affected because there's only so much space you have up there and you're dealing with all this stuff from the past. They call it the duffel bag, right? You know,
Totally.
duffel
Yeah.
bag overflows, but it's not necessarily that traumatic call you went to. It's all of those things. That was just
Mhm.
the Pandora's box, the opening of the duffel bag.
Yeah.
And then once things start coming out, they keep coming.
There's so many great pieces that you've just opened. I love it so much. The piece about the rules in your head in clinical counseling, we talk about this idea of shattered assumptions. And it's this idea that we are all walking around with base assumption at all times, right? Like, I think one of the ones I use as a really easy example often is when I get in my car, my base assumption is I'm getting to my destination safely. I don't for a moment pause and question that. I hop in my car, turn it on, and drive, and I don't think more than 2 seconds about any of it, right? I just go. And it's not until a bad thing happens that shatters that base assumption that interrupts that. And when we have a shattered assumption, when it's been shattered, we suddenly become aware that we had the assumption to begin with. But until then, it's very subconscious. Like we're not aware that we're walking around thinking kids shouldn't die. It's just built into us that we expect that kids shouldn't die. And it's not until we're confronted with these experiences that break that over and over again that we become aware that, oh, I've been walking around with this assumption that suggests that this isn't okay. And yet I'm confronting it over and over and over. So it must be a thing. And then how do we reconcile that, right? So, like for people who have been in a car accident, the really tricky part is how do I get back in a car and do this again when I've had this assumption broken? And so my ability to trust my own safety feels disrupted, right? First responders do this on a scale of like times a bajillion because you guys are constantly confronting those kinds of pieces that normal people, quote unquote, normal people, everyday people, get to hold many of those assumptions without ever having them confronted, right? They live with similar assumptions and they never have to have them broken. But you guys go into situations where they're broken constantly and then have to do that process of reconciling it. And if we don't have a roadmap for even knowing that I'm going to have to do that, then we do things like drink because it is easier. It's a way to default and not have to figure out the process about it, right? And so it's a coping mechanism to be able to survive in the midst of it.
Right. And that's, I was trained by my parents that drinking was the way to manage things like anxiety and depression. And it was
Right.
okay. You don't necessarily listen to what your parents tell you, but you certainly see what they do. Right. So as a
Totally.
small kid, you pick up these lessons in life and you use them. And then even though your self-talk might be denial and things that, I'm not like them, I don't do that. But in a lot of cases, you end up being very similar to your parents. And
Yeah.
especially when it comes to coping, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, you always got to work on yourself, and I do constantly. And I realize, I'm at the top of a hill, and I'm probably as resilient as I've ever been in my life. But I don't take for granted that I could slip back there at any time, and
Yeah.
breathing and positive thinking and you know what, being emotional, whether it be laughter or crying, those are healthy actions, and to suppress crying or emotions is not healthy. And so, for people that battle depression out there, and they're in denial, it's your life can be very sad if
Yeah.
you don't have the courage to recognize some of your factory settings that you might need to expose to yourself, even, right? Like,
Mm.
it's that's Brene Brown is one of my favorite leaders, because it's really courageous to show vulnerability and
Yeah.
step into a forum where you don't necessarily know the outcome. And we do that as first responders all the time, but to do that personally, it's terrifying. Like, you talked about a CTV article. I mean, I published a book when I was an operations chief that is very, very personal, and I
Hmm.
can tell you it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done in my life, because there's credibility at play.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm super respected, but I hold a position that's respected. And,
Totally.
and so to do that was terrifying. But it had sat at a publisher for over a year, and there was a suicide by a RCMP member in Richmond, a young female officer who shot herself because she got in trouble and didn't know her way out, and she thought ending her life would be the way to go. It frustrated me, so I felt like I could get hit by a bus tomorrow and I need to push publish. So I did, and you know
Um,
what, I had zero negative feedback, not that I know of. I haven't had any negative feedback from publishing that book. In fact, I mean, CTV, CBC, all the big newspapers across the country, over 60 newspapers ran that story. So
yeah.
I got nothing but compliments and, nice, kind notes. And so that took me by surprise, that, people
Mm.
are ready for not just Brene Brown, but for everybody to, just show vulnerability. And yeah, it actually felt good.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to some extent, everyone is experiencing just a sense of isolation. I think to some extent, it's why this podcast happened and why it matters to me is that, like I get so many people who come into my office and they're sharing their stories individually in this private, confidential setting. And that's wonderful. And I'm so glad to get to do that work. But then it's fascinating to me that it feels like I often live Groundhog Day, where client to client, it's a very similar story. And I often think if I could just put all of you in a room together, none of you would feel so alone, because you could just know that your story was the exact same as the story I heard right after that. And maybe each of you would feel less lonely in this, but we don't share it because, again, we're afraid of that piece of like the credibility. Does it change how others in my work would see me? Does it change how they would feel safe or be able to trust me if they knew how much I was struggling with things? Would it affect their ability to walk into the fire with me if they don't think that I'm good? And so I got to look like I'm good, even if I'm really, really not. Right. And so I think to some extent, the emails I get in response to this podcast are like, thank you so much for sharing about this. Hearing that one person's story really echoed my own or whatever. And it just really reaffirms that that's so much the challenge that we're still facing is that stigma around sharing. And yet when you do, you see that there's like this craving for it, that when you publish this book, the response is really, really positive from people. Like people want more of that. They want more authenticity. They want space to be human and to have their humanness be okay. And it's really, really cool that when there's these little pieces that we can put out into the world, that it creates a little bit more space for that. I think that that's a really fantastic outcome of your book.
Yeah, it's interesting. Life is a journey, and the subject is yourself, right? Like life is school, and the subject is yourself. That's what I tell kids when I speak to them. And I got asked by someone once, those three kids that passed away, like what was it exactly that bothered you? And I said, well, it was lots of things. It was, I don't. No one should have to do CPR on a little kid,
Yeah.
but doctors do it every day. You know what I mean? No one should have to die, but people die every day. Like there's all these things. And it's interesting because somebody said to me, are you over that call now? And I said, well, I don't know if you ever get over it. I said, one of the things that still bother me, and, I've accepted in clinical counseling, was the last baby was 2 months old. I don't know if that was a boy or a girl. And I can see the diapers as I'm talking to you right now. They were either sails or they were rainbows. That there was white diapers with, curly black hair. And I don't know if it was a boy or a girl. So my clinical counselor said, you should refer to that baby as a boy sometimes and a girl sometimes, or just a baby. And you will never know that answer. In fact, one of the guys that was on that call with me, I asked, what do you think it was? Like, let's guess. And we
Yeah.
couldn't. And so that was one of the weird things that bothered me about that call. I couldn't determine the
Mhm.
sex of the baby we were working on. And that bothered me. Why
Yeah.
should that bother me? It really shouldn't. It's not really a big deal in the
Mhm.
grand scheme of three kids dying. But that's one of the things that has bothered me that I never knew. And
I
what's
mean, it's
interesting?
kind of about like how we fill out a story, right? Like we like to know a story and we like to fill in the gaps to a story to make it feel complete and rounded out. And it sounds like that's one of the details your brain really got hung up on in terms of trying to fill out that story.
Yeah, and firefighters especially, police officers maybe a bit more, but firefighters never get to know the ending. I mean,
Totally.
rarely, right? There's no closure for us. And so that's one thing that makes, paramedics usually can find out. They can find out. Police
They
can
can get
find out.
access, but they also often leave before they really know.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
totally.
So
Yeah, it's
we
for
don't we
sure
don't
hard.
get a lot of closure, right? So
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's hard to know. I did this big job, and who knows if that panned out to something good or not so good.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I've done, I don't know, CPR probably a few hundred times, and you know, I did it before we had AEDs. So our outcomes, I mean, I have more fingers than I have successful resuscitations, right? Out of hundreds, I
Mhm.
don't have a lot of um, good outcomes when I'm
Yeah.
at a full arrest call. So, to be able to see somebody be revived is a magical, special moment. And yeah,
Yeah.
I personally haven't had a lot, but I know lots of people have. Like now with,
Sure.
AEDs, that are getting there so quickly, resuscitations are a lot more successful than they used to be.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's this other piece you brought up that I kind of want to name for a second because I feel like I hear it a lot in my work, and it's the piece about the calls that tend to feel like they add up to break us a little bit more tend to be the ones that also overlap quite strongly with our own personal stories. So, to have several infant deaths in a span of time where your own infant is in the hospital, like that almost becomes this like perfect storm situation, right? I've had a lot of people similar to you talk about, I have a history of suicide in my family, and so suicide calls feel like they differently destabilize me compared to other kinds of calls. I could do other kinds of calls all day long, but those ones are the ones that really set me off. I've got several people who talk about more geriatric patients are the ones that really bother them, or calls where there's abuse involved, right? Like everyone's kind of got their thing that is really, really hard to face, and often it does layer quite closely to their own personal stories and the things that have been hard for them, either recently or earlier in their lives.
Yeah, lots of first responders that have reached out to me. A lot of past trauma, like
Yeah.
lot of people that struggle have had abuse.
Yeah.
Um, I, and if they read my book, they talk about my childhood. But one thing, I was never sexually abused. So for me, my trauma is really about um, just dysfunction. I think it's a
Mhm.
classic low income dysfunctional family. And when
Yeah.
you're a kid, you just think everybody's like that. And
Yeah.
things you did, and, you know, I was a bad kid. And, I look back on my life and my childhood, and I was very embarrassed of it, ashamed, to be honest. But I was also ashamed of my parents. And for a long time, I blamed my parents for everything. But really, it took me a long time to hold myself accountable and look back and say I did all those things. But you know what? I'm not that person, and I've tried very hard to be kind, empathetic and compassionate towards people. And I think that upbringing created that for me. Like, I don't think I become this person unless I did all those things and went through all those. I became something out of that. So then, and a lot of first responders that reach out and talk to me about shame. And for men especially, when
Yeah.
you feel shameful, and then you lose your sense of purpose, that is when suicidal thoughts start to creep in, and then lack of sleep.
Yeah.
And then in many cases, that's where people get close to the edge, is where they start thinking about not so much that they want to die, they just don't want to live anymore, right? They
Yeah.
get The shame hole is a very, very secretive, dark place for people, especially men, because more men
Yeah.
take their own lives than women. But that's quite common. And the sleep piece build up to that moment when they take their lives is also quite common. And manic behavior, and recognizing someone who might be taking their life is hard. But when you look back, sometimes it's not as hard, because I know 3 firefighters in one department who took their lives within 1 year. And when you look back, you could see the signs. But
Mhm.
it was easy to discount them when you're working with them, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to say, hey, in one case, one person was super happy who had been very
Mhm.
depressed for a long time. They were buying people the dinners, they were washing their car, they were quite happy, which made everybody feel happy. But the reason they were so happy is because they had made their decision and they were saying goodbye to everybody.
Mhm.
And they
Yeah.
did. And so, understanding those little pieces of recognition of someone who's troubled, and the signs are the classic ones, as you well know, are when someone attaches a positive statement to them not being here anymore. That
Yeah.
could almost be an emergency, right? Like, the
Mhm.
crisis line is a very, very powerful tool where, with firefighters, I'll give you an example. I got a phone call where a firefighter was very depressed. We all knew this person was very depressed. And one day he said, I think I should remove the guns from my home.
Mhm.
So we immediately acted and got all the guns out of his home. And then we went
Yeah.
there and sat beside him and called the crisis line. And you know what? Ended up driving him to Emerge, and spent,
Yeah.
several weeks in a hospital bed with, care and psychiatric help. And you know what? Got on some meds, and to this day is here and doing quite well and still married. And I just talked to him the other day, and he's playing softball, and he's happy.
Yeah.
But he came
That's
very close, right? Very
yeah.
close. But he had the
Real
courage
common.
to phone someone and say, I think we need to remove the guns from my home, right? And
Yeah.
so that's important, because a lot of people don't make that phone call, right?
Mhm.
So if
Yeah.
we're talking about suicide, I can assure you that from my experience, I don't believe you can prevent it. I believe you can intervene, because when someone wants to take their life, they don't call 911, and they don't
Yeah.
phone a friend. They just
Yeah.
do it. And
Yeah.
so that's what we all wear, right? When we have
Mhm.
friends who we work with that take their lives, we look back and say, I wish I could have done something, or how could they do that? It's such a selfish act. Well, actually, it's probably the bravest act they feel they're ever doing, right? They're helping
Mhm.
people by leaving this planet.
Yeah.
And you can't wear that, even though it's hard to even say that. But that's what
Yeah.
bothers first responders, is when you lose a friend, because you relate,
Yeah.
right? You
Totally.
relate. You
Well, and I
totally
think
relate.
everyone has that story too, right? Of like
Yeah.
knowing someone who is just so close to them who has made that choice. And I think it does. It feels kind of scary to know that we're all vulnerable to that potential of like hopelessness and helplessness and feeling close to the edge.
Yeah. It's, I spoke at a very large leadership conference, and all firefighters and chiefs. And I said, there isn't a person in this room who hasn't had a suicidal thought. And I don't necessarily mean suicidal ideation where you're thinking of taking your life, but you have
Right.
thought about suicide, right? You
Yeah.
see it a lot. And so it creates I almost want to say a creative thinking pattern about suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some very interesting ways people have taken their lives. You don't forget those, right? Jumping
Yeah.
off a building or a bridge, or in Surrey, the Patella
Mm-hmm.
bridge is the go-to bridge, but it used to be the Port Mann, but the new Port Mann's a lot more difficult. I have been to jumpers on the new Port Mann, but it's rare.
Mm-hmm.
And, people go to bridges, and I learned a lot about bridges. I worked with a California Highway Patrol officer by the name of Kevin Briggs, and he taught me how to intervene with someone on a bridge, and body language, and how you speak, and ask permission to talk to them. And this highway patrol officer would deal with 10 people a month, and he's
Wow.
talked
Yeah.
hundreds of people back onto the right side of the rail. And so I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
learn that skill set he had. But, he would say I'd be talking to someone for 2 hours, and we'd having a great conversation, and normally get them food. And once they take the food, you're there. And then he said, you know what, Kevin, it was great talking to you. I got to go. And he was gone. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you just, when you're a first responder, you do your best you can do, and then you try and wrap your head around what just happened, right? And that's where clinical counseling comes in. You get into our head, look through our eyes, and help us unravel it. And that's where the connection is, right? Like, I've seen many clinical counselors that I never connected with until I
Yeah.
found one that I have. And my clinical counselor now is a former police officer. And so I always say, you get it, right? Like, you get it.
Totally.
Because she does
Yeah.
get it, and she gets me. So it's all
Yeah.
about that connection, right? So
Totally.
connecting with someone and being able to talk, and the clinical counselor getting inside your head and seeing why you're struggling and helping you unravel that's where
Mm-hmm.
the magic is, right? There's no magic when it comes to mental health, but the magic of getting better is that.
Behind the Line is sponsored by Beating the Breaking Point. Beating the Breaking Point is a 7-part online training program designed specifically for first responders and frontline workers, and tailored to fill the gaps in your training to support resilience and sustainability. Whether you're new to the work and wanting to cultivate tools to prevent burnout, compassion fatigue, and related concerns, or you are deep into your years on the job and have gone a few rounds with burnout and other mental health challenges, this program offers the foundational pieces you need to support personal and professional wellness for the long haul. You are a helper. You love your work and you sacrifice a lot. Investing in you and your sustainability is the best gift you can give yourself and those who lean on you. We make this program as risk-free as possible by offering a limited money-back guarantee to ensure that it's a fit for you. If you enjoy Behind the Line, you are going to love this program. Google Beating the Breaking Point Lindsay and find everything you need to get started, or use the link in the show notes. Now, back to the episode. Yeah. Well, and I think so much of what our role is really helping people build awareness of their own stories, right? And I think that's actually a really interesting part of your story is that you then wrote that story and you published it. But that's kind of the job is how do you help someone, because so many of us are living in autopilot so much of the time. We just wake up, wash, rinse, repeat, right? And we don't stop and look at it or ask questions about it or get curious about how we do and why we continue to do things that don't serve us particularly well, whether we enjoy things we're doing or if we're just doing them for the sake of doing them. And so our role is really to help people slow down the process for a second and step out of the autopilot and be a bit more intentional about how they're interacting with their own lives. How we tell our own story shapes how we feel about our story and how we continue to engage in our story. And so we get to shape that. We get to be intentional about it. But in order to do that, we actually have to stop and be intentional about it. We can't just continue to live in default mode where it is very autopilot. and we just do and do and do without stopping. And so that you're right that our job is really to just help people kind of see their own story in this in a mildly different way, and not necessarily a fantasy way, but a more realistic based way. And then get to shape that narrative for themselves going forward instead of feeling like they're victims of whatever has happened up to this point and they just have to continue living out this story that's already been determined. That they get to choose what comes next. Like it's a choose your own ending. You get to pick the direction of it. I think one of the things that you said that also really hit me though was the piece about preventing suicide. And I think you're right that like when people are in real crisis, it is really hard to prevent suicide. Like it's hard to intervene to a degree that really makes it different, because if someone is really set and determined, they can be very set and determined, and it's very difficult to do a whole heck of a lot about it. I do think that one of the things though that I really wish were talked about more is the what to watch for way sooner, so that we weren't getting so far down the road where people are feeling so lost and hopeless for so long, right? So like I know you mentioned that when you were struggling after those 3 infant death calls at the time that your daughter was young, you mentioned this piece about noticing that it showed up as like suddenly I had the flu. And then, right, like there were these various symptoms that became indicators that I'm not doing great, right? And I think one of the really fascinating things that a lot of people don't talk about is that PTSD can manifest itself physiologically in body related illnesses, right? So we talk often about like the different mental health signs and signals to look for, but we don't necessarily talk about the physical signs and symptoms to look for, right? So we talk about things like if you're numbing out a lot, or if you're noticing that you're drinking more, or if you're noticing that you are missing things, or if you notice that you're vigilant a lot of the times, that means PTSD. But PTSD can also be showing up in ways that are very physical. And it's actually interesting because we did an interview with a retired RCMP officer, Jen Pound, and she talked about that as well, that her symptoms were entirely physical. So when she finally went to her doctor and her doctor couldn't diagnose her with anything, it became this question mark. No one knew how to handle her. And yet really what it was PTSD manifesting in her body, right? So we get sick with a lot of things. We suddenly discover that we've got new illnesses or ailments that are weird and wonky and kind of out of left field, but they're like the body's way of showing the tension that it's been holding for so long. And it can't continue to hold and contain anymore.
Yeah, Jen's story is, I mean, when you're the face of iHit and you are dealing with families, you have a very strong emotional attachment to very troubling situations. The costs there, like, I think they learned a lot from Jen's story on how to manage people. The department I'm in now, we're extremely progressive when it comes to finding new ways to help members, recognizing all of our members are trained in recognition. All of our chiefs are trained, educated on how to react. We have an app-based program for every member to do self-checks to see how they're doing through UBC, through Heads Up Guys. We have 4 clinical counselors attached to our wellness program. We have a psychologist. Yeah. We have a program that's very progressive. But when I say you can't prevent suicide, maybe you can't prevent all suicides, but even being that open and that progressive and letting every member know, if you're struggling, come see us, we will help you, doesn't mean they will. And in fact, when I struggled, I didn't miss a day of work. I want people covered my shifts. I just asked for, but I had withdrawn from all my friends. My only concern was nobody finds out about this. And that stigma still exists to this day. I've talked to lots of firefighters who have come back from being off for, 6, 8, 12 months, over a year, and they feel they wish nobody knew, because the culture, the fire service culture, it's tough. It is a tough culture. And it even though we all talk about, how supportive we are quietly not as supportive as we say, right? You're on the back with someone, and, I had a call where 3 kids were killed in a car crash, very public, all over the news. And, one of the crews that went there was traumatized, very traumatized, taken out of service immediately. And I had to call in another crew, but the captain of that crew had just come back from 6 months off being on a mental health
Right.
claim. So now, you're extricating bodies and you've just come back. You
Yeah.
know, it's a tough culture to be able to protect your members, because when they come back, they have to be ready to be able to do that job. And that job, you don't know when you put your gear on the truck, you don't know what's coming your way, and you can't. That's what I realized as a chief. That's what I realized, when you're a captain, you cannot protect your crew's mental health because you don't know what's coming your way. So it's
Yeah.
tough. It's a tough job. And then when you do take a knee and you do say I'm struggling, I'm a big believer if you can get better while at work rather than completely imploding, it's the way to go. So I empower everybody to take a good look at themselves so they can stay working. And even as an employer, it's always in our best interest when our employees are working and not sick.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very progressive way to look at it, is how do we help you? What can we do for you? How do we support you? And for the most part, it works pretty well, but it is not perfect. And we're very progressive and open department on mental health. But right now we have 1/3 of our department off. That's how we're
Mhm.
struggling like everybody else. These are tough times. COVID has really affected first responders. And
Yeah.
my book's called The Unbroken, and I consider myself one of the unbroken. But I certainly broke there, but now I'm unbroken. But there's a lot of unbroken people holding it together to continue to, especially nurses and doctors. Like, it's
Mhm.
just people are just continuing to plow through this, and yeah, it's tough. It's tough to watch and tough to do. So that's where you can't even get into a clinical counselor. That's
I
why we have 4 attached to
I
our
know.
department, because our
Yeah.
members can't get into them.
Yeah, I know. We have the same kind of challenge. I have a contract with a first response organization, and I think, one of six connected to that contract. And thankfully, they've let me subcontract it to others within my team, because I can't take any more. And so I'm often rediverting after they've called all six on the list, and none of us can take them. I have this little angle that I can redivert to another person on our team who isn't directly named in the contract, but I can divert to. And thank God for that, because I think that's the only way that we're continuing to maintain the level of need that we're seeing come through that contract. It's a lot. And it's been a lot for a long time.
Yeah, and the missing piece that first responders are not very good at is the family piece, right? So we have such a high divorce rate in
Yeah,
policing,
it's true.
fire, and paramedicine. And one of the things that we're better at least in our department, is like we have a clinical counselor set up for our firefighters' kids, so
Yeah.
that once you hit 12, you have the access to talk to this clinical counselor, because if our families aren't doing well, we're not doing well, right? And we come to work, and we're divorce is still quite high for first responders, and
Mhm.
it's because we don't address that piece. So as a department, we address that piece. We want to
Yeah.
help you, your spouse, your partner, and your kids, and we want to make sure that we're there if you need us. And it took us a long time to get there, but
I
we're
love
there.
that that's a thing you guys are doing. I think that that's really rare but lovely. Yeah. I think that if I wish that there were more things like that that existed, and more intentional leadership that oriented to some of those needs, because I think it would make a huge difference if we saw that on a broader scope and scale across the board, rather than that being the exception. If it were the rule, that would be a really cool piece.
Yeah, you know what? Clinical counseling for members that haven't imploded yet is
Yeah.
preventative maintenance, right? And I talk about it. I try and go once a month, and some days I sit down and I really got nothing to talk about. But you
Yeah.
know what? It's part of my preventative maintenance, and I empower people to do the same and just kind of get in a routine, like just work on yourself, figure out what questions to ask before you go in. Like, I had a person phoned me about a week ago, and they were in in a store, and they were having this, said, like a battery in their chest. And I said, "You ever had anxiety before?" And they're like, "No." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to give you some breathing tips.
Mhm.
Try this next time it comes on, and focus your breathing." And so they said that, that they came back and they tried it, and they said, "That works. Where did you get that breathing?" And I said, "Well, I actually had a breathing coach because I had to battle anxiety. And, one of the ways to calm my anxiety was to change the rhythm of my heart, which you can do through your breathing. So once you
Totally.
learn things like that, right, and
Mm-hmm.
you can use them. And, I have lots of people phone me when they're scared and I'm having a
Yeah.
suicidal thought. And, I don't want my wife to know. And I said, okay, go up into the shower and turn it on cold. Why? Just go do it and phone me back. And they're like,
Yeah.
okay, that was amazing. I go, yeah, you just took control of your body. Your thoughts, right? You just told your body, I'm in control. So I know you
Mm-hmm.
feel like you're losing control and those thoughts are creeping in, but you can control them. That's why you need to go to a clinical counselor, is to figure out
Mm-hmm.
why you're having those thoughts, and then how to control them. And they're like, okay, I'll go right away. I'll book an appointment. They're
Booking the
excited.
appointment. Good luck. It'll take 6 months, but I'll get
Yeah,
there. Yeah,
yeah, and
totally. That's, I mean, the challenge of the now. But to some extent, that was one of the other reasons that this podcast felt important, was how do we disseminate those tricks? Because some of them aren't rocket science. Like, they're not like secret tools that clinical counselors are like hiding from the world and only offering when you pay $150 a session. It's something that we want people to know about. It's just really hard to get people to know about them. And so we've done so many episodes that have really just been focused on how do we give some grounding tools? How do we teach some breathing techniques? How do we give some of these tips and tricks that I feel like I'm talking about to people all the time at my day job? How do we make that more accessible so that people can maybe, and especially for those people who aren't necessarily in need of like high crisis intervention, they're doing okay. But to have these tools would let you do okay a lot longer than if you didn't have them, right? And it helps you notice what you need to notice a little sooner instead of waiting until you're so far down the drain that now we are in crisis mode or verging on it. How do we catch that a little bit quicker? And so many of the episodes that we've done have been talking about those exact kinds of tools, because it's so great when we have access to them and don't feel like there's something that we have to phone a friend to get in the mall when I'm having a panic attack or whatever.
yeah. All of our firefighters have had training on getting in the now, regardless if they like it or buy in or not. They still get the training, and it's just things like, you get out into nature. Those trees are giving off microbes, and by standing next to a tree, I know it sounds crazy,
Mm-hmm.
it has a healing presence. If you really want to get deep into that, take your shoes off, stand there in your bare feet, and look at that forest you're standing in. Those
Mm-hmm.
trees are connected by roots under the ground for thousands of miles. You just became part of that connection. Like, it's just little cool thinking techniques. And you think about breathing, it's been around for thousands of years. It's the basis of meditation. That's why meditation works. But
Yeah.
driving to a commercial structure fire that's just been upgraded to a third alarm, being able to control your heart rhythm en route to that call is magic. And once someone who a little anxious about, going to a shooting or a bad call or a
Yeah.
big fire that they're going to have to manage, they can control their heart rhythm and get into a state of readiness before they get there.
Mhm.
They only got to do that one time, and at work where they're sold. They're like,
Yeah.
wow, well, that's been around for thousands of years, people, and it
Yeah.
works like a charm, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We actually did an interview back in the fall with a woman named Olivia Mead, and she owns Yoga for First Responders. And it's a program that's taught across various fire fire services across the United States, as well as other first response groups. And it's really cool because she talks about how she did. She participated in a training alongside several firefighters, and they did an enclosed spaces training. And so she was put into the suit and the mask and all of the things, and entrapped in this enclosed space. And she talks about how she almost lost her shit, and yet the way she held it together was, she's like, I'm grounded into all my yoga skills. I'm doing all the breathing and all the centering. And it was cool. She was talking about how she wouldn't teach someone to do something that she didn't think would work, and so she wanted to try it to make sure that it did. And that it's what let her get through that little chunk of time. And so it was the thing that she then passed along to so many within the programs that they're running. And so many people have found that helpful for those moments where they are stuck or they feel like they can't get out. And it, right. And that can be in closed spaces, but it can also just be a call. Like when we're in a call, there's no, I vote to not do this. Like there's no, we are doing this. It is happening. It's not optional. And so sometimes I think a lot of people get into that feeling of being trapped in those moments. How do we help you to not feel so out of control in this moment and regain a little control, even if it's just over your own body?
Yeah, and preparation, like if you look, I'll give you an example. I've done a lot of deployments into the wildfires, and one time I was in a place in the Caribou, and we had firefighters spread all over the place. So we worked for pretty much 2 straight days, but we had to get to sleep. So we created a night shift, and the fire was coming down the mountain to where we were, but we had to go to sleep. And there's so many little hacks for you to get sleep. Like if you look at what the work Navy SEALs do when they're in a very hyper vigilant place and an unsafe place, they will, sleep for 10 minutes. They'll put their legs up on a log or on a mattress, and then all the majority of the blood's down in their torso area. They will close their eyes and imagine that they're in a safe room in a hammock and it's dark, or in a boat in the middle of a lake. Like they create
Mm.
this safe place in their mind for
Yeah.
10 minutes, and
Yeah.
they pretty much get 10 minutes of restfulness sleep, and then they can function a little longer and do their tasks. And I think those little hacks to learn are really important, especially for first responders to get. I work with a lot of, well, I don't as much as a chief, but I used to work with a lot of young incident commanders. So I would teach emergency scene management, and a lot of them battled anxiety and confidence.
Mm.
That
Yeah.
job is all about confidence. So what I would get them to do is when you arrive at a house fire, I'll just use a house fire or a warehouse, you have to paint a picture for all the trucks that are coming in. So
Mhm.
you are on display as soon as you arrive. I have a 4-story wood frame residential commercial structure fire, flames and smoke showing on the alpha side. I got people trapped on the bravo side. You just practice those things. And if you can do the first part right of anything, just get started. You'll build up confidence in that first minute, and the rest will just unfold. But you need to get started because that thing is not stopping, and
Mm.
you've got to do it. So do the first part right, and the rest will just unfold. And
Yeah.
I think that's life right there. Like, no matter what you're going through, you just get started, and you know what? It'll unfold on its own, and you can try and steer it, right?
Totally. I love that as a summary point. I'm curious if there's any other pieces, Steve, that you would, share for those who are new to the work, those who are kind of getting their feet wet in it and have the opportunity to do something a bit more preventative. Are there other pieces that you would want to share, kind of words of wisdom?
Yeah, I think if you're a first responder, I think the greatest thing you could learn early is detachment. So try not to bring your calls home to your family. And one of the ways to do that, like Jocko Willink is actually a Navy SEAL, and he's an expert on detachment. So,
Mm.
like not wearing your uniform home. In our fire hall, they bug me and say, they call me Coach Lasso, but I've got your back over I've got your back over doorways. One of the other chiefs suggested we do this, and I was like, absolutely. And you know, detaching from the hall when you leave, or your police car or your ambulance, being able to detach, find a way to do that. And sometimes it's walking into the forest like we talked about and looking for 3 shades of green, like actually
Yeah.
consciously making yourself detach,
Yeah.
right? Cold water is a perfect example. You have no choice but to detach because you're like shocking your system. Like find
Mhm.
ways that work for you to detach and leave that at work. And I think if that's one thing a new first responder could learn, it will allow them to retire healthy and happy. And it's a very, very powerful thing to learn. And I didn't learn it, so I kind of learned it the hard way, where I had to learn it because it was affecting my family. It was affecting my ability to sleep. And so, yeah, detaching is a very, very important. But everybody's got different factory settings, so you got to figure out how you can detach. So,
Yeah. Good one. Well, and detaching is like a learned skill, right? Like most things, we don't, most of us don't have that in our factory settings to be able to just cut something off there and carry on. And so the really hard thing that we're fighting is our own humanness, which is one of the things I talk about a lot is that like no one's actually wired at their factory settings to do this job. No one is built for this without it being something where I often say that no one comes out unscathed. Like we're wired in a way where these kinds of jobs will do some amount of damage because that's the nature of the job and the nature of how we're wired. Learning ways to kind of close the book on today here and then open the book on today when I go home, and that detaching piece, you're right, is really important. We often talk about this idea of how do we kind of make that transition. So how do we kind of end the day at my job and close that and make it feel like I can look at that and tell the story of what I did today in a way that I can feel okay about, right? There were really hard things. No one should have had to have seen what I saw today, and yet I did that. I can feel proud of the work I did. I can know that I responded in my best ability, etc. Can I tell that story in a way that lets it feel closed for today? And then can I have like a transition ritual that helps me move from A to B, where I then open up the story of when I walk into my house, the kind of parent I want to be, the kind of spouse I want to be, the kind of, household contributor I want to be. And how do I create that transition period? So whether it is going out in nature or if it's like listening to my favorite music in the car on the ride home, we often talk with people about creating like a transition activity between A and B. So like for a lot of people, going to the gym in between, blaring my music and kind of getting the day out of my system can be really key to that. And so just like little adjustments that help us make that shift so that I can close the book on one and then open the book to the kind of person I want to be in my home life on the other side of it, without feeling like it's all trailing together in this like unending loop.
I think the toughest thing for me to learn, and maybe a good thing to end on, is I always tell people to be kind because it feels good, but be kind to yourself, because I beat myself up and I really didn't like myself for so long. I think if you can find a way to be kind to yourself, it's okay to struggle. It's fine. It's
Mm-hmm.
okay to have emotions. All those things are okay, but you really got to cut yourself some slack when you're feeling crappy, and it's hard to do. And I had to learn it. It was very hard for me to learn. But
Mm-hmm.
that is one thing I think is really important, is being able to be kind to yourself.
Yeah, totally true. All right, Steve, it was delightful getting to chat with you, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to connect. I am excited to be able to post some links in our show notes to your book and your podcast and some of that jazz. So if those who are listening want to go check it out, they can find out all about you. So I will make sure that that's all available in the show notes for those listening.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for helping first responders.
You bet, my pleasure. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye bye. I
I want to say one more big thank you to my guest for today. It is so wonderful to get to have this opportunity to talk to some incredible and amazing people who have been out there doing the work, seeing the stuff, and figuring out how to hold it differently. I'm so grateful for the willingness of these incredible people to jump on with me, share their stories, and share with you the various ways that they're learning and finding to move through this kind of work with some amount of sanity intact. I think we can all take something really special from that. As we wrap up today, I want to encourage you to please reach out and connect if you have any questions or feedback. You know I love hearing from you and shaping this podcast to echo your needs and interests. I also love hearing about what you're working on and how you're using what we talk about on the show. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Lindsay A. Foss, or you can email me at support@thrive-life.ca. If you have any feedback for my amazing guest today, please let me know, and I'm happy to pass it along. I continue to be so amazed and inspired by this community that we are building and creating together. I'm so grateful for your support and that many of you are so incredibly keen to share about Behind the Line to others on the front lines. Thank you so much for sharing with those you know. I want to let you know that we do have ways to support sharing. So if you reach out to me, I can send you posters and cards and all kinds of other ways that you can share with your workplace and your colleagues about Behind the Line and our other resources. Also know that you can share any of our social media posts or forward any of our emails that we send you with reminders about the show. We just want more people to be supported. Know that we can be found online on our website, on most major podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube. Many of our summer series episodes will be videotaped, and we will include those recordings on YouTube. So check those out if you want to join us in real life. Click subscribe to get alerts about our latest episodes, or subscribe to our email list to hear from me about all the exciting things we have going on and coming up. You'll find all the details you need in the show notes, and you can access our email list by clicking to get our free Beating the Breaking Point Indicators Checklist and Triage Guide, which helps you facilitate self-assessing burnout and related concerns. We make all of our different resources available to you guys because the work you do really, really matters to our communities, but way more than that, you matter. Your life matters, and the people who matter to you matter. And we want to make sure that you have what you need to keep up the good work at work, but as well in your very real and amazing life outside of the work. So use it and share it. And until next time, stay safe.